In the port of Ningbo-Zhoushan, on the eastern coast of China, a very large crude carrier sits at anchor with its cargo holds empty. The ship is 1,100 feet long. It can carry 2 million barrels of oil. At current prices, that cargo is worth approximately $160 million per voyage. The ship's operator has been waiting 23 days for a cargo booking that has not come, because the cargo that was supposed to fill it is sitting in the Persian Gulf on a different tanker, which is sitting 40 nautical miles outside the Strait of Hormuz, which is closed. In Beijing, 800 miles to the northwest, a different kind of calculation is running. Not about oil prices, not about tanker rates, not about the $40 billion per week the closed strait is costing the global economy. Though that number is on every screen in the People's Bank of China right now. The calculation running in Beijing is about something that does not appear in any news coverage of the Hormuz crisis, something that has nothing to do with Iran, or with oil, or with the mines on the floor of the strait. The calculation is about Taiwan, and what the United States Navy just demonstrated it can do. China imports 10.7 million barrels of crude oil per day. Approximately 40% of that, 4.3 million barrels, transits the Strait of Hormuz. The rest comes from Russia overland, from Angola and Brazil on long Atlantic routes, and from domestic production that covers roughly 30% of total consumption. The 4.3 million barrels per day that normally move through Hormuz do not move anymore. At $74 per barrel, the daily cost of that supply disruption to the Chinese economy is approximately $318 million per day. The disruption has now lasted 47 days. Total economic impact to China's oil supply chain, approximately $14.9 billion and counting. That number does not include the secondary effects, elevated LNG prices. As Chinese buyers scramble for alternatives, the cost of drawing down strategic petroleum reserves that took years to accumulate, the industrial slowdown in coastal manufacturing provinces, where electricity generation runs on fuel oil that is now significantly more expensive. China did not start this crisis. China is not a party to this conflict. China has made clear through every diplomatic channel available that it considers the Hormuz standoff a bilateral matter between the United States and Iran. And China is being economically devastated by it anyway, passively, without being targeted. Simply by existing in a world where 20% of global oil supply passes through a strait, the United States Navy just demonstrated it can close to anyone it chooses, at any time it chooses, for any reason it chooses. That realization, and not the oil price, is what is keeping Chinese naval planners awake right now. Subscribe to Navy Decoded. We do not cover oil markets. We calculate what naval power actually means for the countries watching from the outside. Here is the number that does not appear in any Western coverage of the Hormuz crisis. In a conflict over Taiwan, a conflict that China's military doctrine describes as a core national interest, a conflict that China's People's Liberation Army Navy has been building toward for 30 years, approximately 83% of China's imported oil and 100% of its imported liquefied natural gas travels through sea lanes that the United States Navy either directly controls or can interdict within 72 hours. The Strait of Malacca, the Lombok Strait, the Sunda Strait, the South China Sea transit routes, the Indian Ocean corridor from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea. Every one of them. China has a name for this vulnerability. It is called the Malacca Dilemma. Former Chinese President Hu Jintao identified it explicitly in 2003. The Chinese Communist Party has been trying to solve it ever since. It has not solved it. And what is happening at Hormuz right now is not just an oil supply problem for China. It is a live-fire demonstration of exactly what losing a naval confrontation with the United States would mean for the Chinese economy, conducted not in a war game, not in a think tank report. On the actual seafloor of the actual Strait of Hormuz, with real mines, real carriers, real A-10s, and a real economy hemorrhaging $318 million a day without a single Chinese sailor being targeted. Beijing is not watching the Hormuz standoff. Beijing is studying it. Because everything the United States Navy is doing to Iran right now is a preview of everything it could do to China. And China is taking notes on what works, what fails, and what it needs to build before the next crisis is its own. To understand what China is learning from Hormuz, you first need to understand the geography of China's energy dependency, because it is the geography, not the politics, that determines everything. China's industrial economy runs on imported energy. The country is the world's largest importer of crude oil, the world's largest importer of liquefied natural gas, and the world's largest importer of iron ore, all of which travel by sea. In 2023, China imported 564 million metric tons of crude oil. Of that total, approximately 40% originated in the Middle East, from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait, and Oman, and the entirety of that Middle Eastern supply transits the Strait of Hormuz before entering the Indian Ocean. From Hormuz, the tankers head east across the Indian Ocean, passing through either the Strait of Malacca between Malaysia and Singapore, or through the Lombok and Sunda Straits further south through the Indonesian archipelago. All three of those choke points are within range of U.S. Navy surface and submarine forces, operating from bases in Singapore, Diego Garcia, Guam, and Japan. The Strait of Malacca is the primary route. It is 550 miles long, and at its narrowest point, the Phillips Channel near Singapore, 1.5 miles wide. Approximately 90,000 ships transit it annually. More cargo moves through the Malacca Strait than through the Suez Canal and the Panama Canal combined. The United States Navy, operating from Changi Naval Base in Singapore and from 7th Fleet headquarters in Yokosuka, Japan, could close the Malacca Strait to Chinese shipping within hours of a conflict over Taiwan commencing. Not by mining it, as Iran mined Hormuz, by presence, by the threat of submarine interdiction, by the credible capability to sink every Chinese-flagged tanker attempting transit within range of a Virginia-class submarine's Mark 48 torpedo. A Mark 48 torpedo costs $3.5 million. A very large crude carrier carrying 2 million barrels of oil is worth $160 million in cargo and $130 million as a vessel. China runs 130 VLCCs on the Middle East route. The math is not complicated. China's strategic planners have known this for 20 years. What they have not seen until now is what it actually looks like when a naval power executes energy supply interdiction in real time against an adversary that cannot stop it. Now they are watching it happen. 47 days, $14.9 billion, 0 Chinese warships able to intervene, 0 diplomatic leverage sufficient to reopen the strait, 0 alternative routes that can move 4.3 million barrels per day that were moving through Hormuz. The Malacca Dilemma is no longer a theoretical vulnerability in a strategic planning document. It is a data set. Beijing is not watching Hormuz as a passive observer. The People's Liberation Army Navy has analysts embedded in its strategic research institutes who are producing operational assessments of every tactical decision the United States Navy has made in this crisis. Those assessments inform doctrine, procurement, and the deployment timeline of capabilities that do not exist yet but are being accelerated because of what is happening in the strait right now. There are 4 specific lessons China is extracting from Hormuz, and each one has a direct implication for any future conflict in the Western Pacific. The first lesson is about mine warfare and the MCM Gap. China has observed that Iran's mine campaign, 5,000 to 6,000 mines, the largest regional inventory in the world, has been the single most effective element of its anti-access strategy. The mines did not need to sink a carrier. They needed only to create the credible threat of sinking a tanker to collapse commercial transit through the strait. Lloyd's of London's war risk premium mechanism, which we covered in our mine breakdown, is the weapon Iran actually used. The mine is the trigger. The insurance market is the kill mechanism. China's mine inventory is estimated at between 50,000 and 100,000 naval mines of multiple types, including influence mines, rocket-propelled rising mines, and encapsulated torpedo mines that can be laid by submarine. China has studied the EM-52 closely. It designed the predecessor that Iran copied. China understands mine warfare at a level of sophistication that exceeds Iran's by a significant margin. What China is specifically studying at Hormuz is the American MCM response. The Avenger-class vessels, the ALMDS laser detection system, the AQS-20C sonar, the Archerfish disposal vehicles. China is assessing how long it takes the U.S. Navy to clear a mined corridor, what the throughput rate of mine disposal is per 24-hour period, and what ratio of mine inventory to MCM capacity is required to sustain a strait closure for a strategically meaningful duration. If China mines the Taiwan Strait or the approaches to the first island chain, how long does the U.S. Navy need to clear it? The Hormuz operation is answering that question with operational data that no simulation can replicate. The second lesson is about the combined arms response and its gaps. China observed that Iran's swarm boat doctrine, 500 fast attack craft designed to saturate Aegis fire control systems, was defeated not by the Aegis systems, but by A-10 Warthogs and Army AH-64 Apaches operating from expeditionary sea bases. The Navy's vertical launch system cells, which China's anti-ship missile doctrine is specifically designed to drain, were preserved by the Air Force and Army, filling the close-in engagement role. This is a significant data point for Chinese planners. China's anti-ship missile doctrine, the DF-21D and DF-26B carrier-killer ballistic missiles, the YJ-18 and YJ-12 supersonic cruise missiles, is designed around the assumption that the United States responds with carrier air wings and Aegis intercept missiles, creating a cost exchange ratio that favors China. The combined arms response that the U.S. executed at Hormuz changes that assumption. If A-10s and Apaches absorb the close-in saturation mission, the VLS cells remain loaded for the missile threats that actually justify the cost. China is now wargaming what a combined joint force response, not a Navy-only response, looks like against its own anti-ship architecture. The Hormuz data is feeding those war games. The third lesson is about electronic warfare and the SEWIP problem, the AN/SLQ-32V6. SEWIP Block 3 system, which we covered in the carrier script, made Iran's Noor cruise missiles miss, not by shooting them down, by making them target a ghost. The missile's seeker is deceived into terminal guidance error by a false return generated by the jammer at a distance from the actual hull. China's YJ-18 and YJ-12 anti-ship cruise missiles use similar seeker architectures to the Noor, radar-guided with infrared backup in the terminal phase. If SEWIP Block 3 can defeat Noor terminal guidance, the question Chinese electronic warfare engineers are urgently asking is whether it can defeat YJ-18 and YJ-12 terminal guidance, and if so, how to modify the seeker to defeat the jammer. The Hormuz crisis is a live test of American electronic warfare capability that China could not have purchased from any intelligence collection operation. Every Noor missile that missed because of SEWIP is a data point for Chinese seeker engineers. The fourth lesson is about economic warfare and the insurance mechanism. China's war planning for Taiwan has historically focused on military timelines. How quickly can the PLA seize the island before U.S. forces can intervene? The Hormuz crisis has introduced a variable that Chinese planners underweighted: the economic cost of the conflict to China itself, independent of military outcome. A Taiwan conflict does not just close the Taiwan Strait. It triggers U.S. and allied sanctions against China, the same mechanism that has isolated Russia since 2022, magnified by the far greater integration of the Chinese economy with Western financial systems. It triggers war risk insurance cancellations on all shipping to and from Chinese ports. It triggers supply chain realignment by every major manufacturer currently operating in China. China does not need to lose the military campaign over Taiwan to lose the conflict. It needs only to sustain economic damage beyond the threshold that the CCP's domestic legitimacy can absorb. The Hormuz crisis is demonstrating, in real time, what that damage looks like when it accumulates at $318 million per day. 47 days in, and the Chinese economy is visibly stressed. A Taiwan conflict would impose that stress at a multiple of the current rate, with no diplomatic off-ramp, for a duration measured not in weeks, but in years. Beijing is studying the Hormuz economic damage model as carefully as it is studying the military operations, because the economic war is the one it cannot win with a carrier, a missile, or a mine. China is not only studying Hormuz, it is accelerating procurement and doctrine changes in direct response to what it is observing. The first response is the expansion of the People's Liberation Army Navy's mine countermeasure capability. China currently operates 42 mine countermeasure vessels of various classes, including the Type 081 Minesweeper, the Type 0822 Minehunter, and the newer Type 805, which entered service in 2021. These are purpose-built MCM hulls, fiberglass and non-magnetic construction, acoustic isolation for their propulsion systems, hull-mounted sonar for mine detection. They are capable. But 42 vessels across the entire plan is insufficient to contest a determined U.S. Navy mine campaign in the approaches to Taiwan. China is currently constructing additional Type 805 hulls at the Wuchang shipyard in Wuhan. The construction rate has accelerated since January 2026. Intelligence community reporting suggests 6 to 8 additional hulls are under construction or on order. The acceleration began after the Hormuz mine campaign demonstrated that MCM capacity is the binding constraint on how long a mined corridor stays closed. The second response is accelerated development of the DF-27 hypersonic anti-ship missile. The Hormuz crisis demonstrated that Iran's Mach 0.9 cruise missiles are vulnerable to American electronic warfare and intercept systems. China's existing anti-ship cruise missiles operate in similar speed regimes. The DF-27 hypersonic glide vehicle, which completes its terminal phase at speeds between Mach 5 and Mach 10, is specifically designed to defeat the intercept envelope of SM-3 and SM-6 missiles and to exceed the processing speed of any known electronic warfare seeker deception system. The DF-27 is not operational yet. Its development timeline has been compressed based on the SEWIP data being extracted from the Hormuz operations. China is not trying to build a faster Noor. China is trying to build a missile that moves too fast for SEWIP to generate a useful false return before the seeker goes terminal. The third response is the acceleration of the String of Pearls energy security strategy. China has been constructing port facilities, pipelines, and energy import infrastructure across the Indian Ocean rim for 20 years. In Pakistan at Gwadar, in Sri Lanka at Hambantota, in Myanmar at Kyaukphyu, in Djibouti, in Tanzania. The stated purpose is commercial. The strategic purpose is to create alternative energy import routes that do not pass through U.S. Navy-controlled choke points. The Hormuz crisis has added urgency to every one of these projects. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor Pipeline, which runs from Gwadar on the Arabian Sea coast of Pakistan overland to Kashgar in Xinjiang, can potentially carry oil from the Persian Gulf to China without transiting any maritime choke point controlled by the United States. Its current capacity is far below what China needs. China is accelerating the expansion. It will not solve the Malacca Dilemma before a Taiwan conflict could occur, but every barrel of oil that can move overland is one less barrel that depends on sea lanes the United States can interdict. At this point in most coverage of China's relationship to the Hormuz crisis, the analysis stops. China is economically impacted. China is watching. China is taking notes. That framing treats China as a spectator. It is wrong. This is Navy decoded. And the real question is not what China is learning from Hormuz. The real question is what the United States is learning about China from watching China watch Hormuz. Because every Chinese procurement decision, every doctrine revision, every accelerated shipbuilding program that the Hormuz crisis is driving in Beijing is visible to American intelligence. And the patterns of that acceleration reveal something that changes the American strategic calculus in the Western Pacific in ways that most analysts have not yet processed. The answer involves three variables that the news coverage consistently ignores. What the Chinese acceleration timeline tells us about Beijing's Taiwan window, what the plan's MCM expansion reveals about Chinese war planning assumptions, and one decision the United States Navy is making right now at Hormuz that has nothing to do with Iran and everything to do with the conflict that has not started yet. Variable 1, what Chinese acceleration reveals about the Taiwan timeline. If China believed its Taiwan operation would occur in 2030 or later, the procurement accelerations being observed now, Type 805 MCM hulls, DF-27 development compression, String of Pearls infrastructure investment, would be scheduled for initiation in 2025 or 2026 because major naval construction and missile development programs operate on 5 to 8 year timelines. The accelerations being observed now began before the Hormuz crisis, but have increased in pace since January 2026. The Type 805 construction acceleration in particular suggests that Chinese military planners believe they need the additional MCM capacity operationally ready within 3 to 5 years. 3 to 5 years from 2026 is 2029 to 2031. That range is consistent with the intelligence community's publicly stated assessment, confirmed by outgoing Indopacom Commander Admiral John Aquilino in 2023, that China's military is being instructed to be ready to seize Taiwan by 2027. The Hormuz crisis has not changed that timeline, but it has confirmed that China is accelerating toward it, because the operational data from Hormuz has revealed vulnerabilities in China's existing doctrine and capability that Chinese planners believe must be addressed before a Taiwan operation can succeed. The acceleration is the signal. The signal says the window China is planning for is real, it is near, and China believes it needs to solve problems it previously considered manageable before that window opens. Variable 2, what the MCM expansion reveals about Chinese war planning. China is not building additional mine countermeasure vessels because it is afraid of American mines and the approaches to Taiwan. It is building them because the Hormuz crisis demonstrated that MCM capability determines how long a conflict can be sustained in a mined strait, and China intends to mine the Taiwan Strait. The Taiwan Strait is 110 miles wide at its broadest point and 80 miles at its narrowest. It carries a significant fraction of global semiconductor traffic. Taiwan produces 63% of the world's semiconductors and 92% of advanced chips below 10 nanometers. Closing the Taiwan Strait to commercial shipping for the duration of a conflict creates an economic shock to the global technology supply chain that compounds every day the conflict continues. China's war plan for Taiwan does not require the rapid seizure of the island in a single amphibious assault. An alternative approach, contested by some PLA analysts, supported by others, involves a blockade. Seal the Taiwan Strait, cut the island's supply lines, force economic capitulation without the catastrophic casualty costs of a D-Day, scale amphibious landing against prepared defenses. For a blockade strategy, MCM capability is critical, because the United States' response to a Chinese blockade of Taiwan will include mining the very strait China is trying to control. America's Mk-60 Captor mines, Mk-67 submarine-launched mobile mines, and quick-strike air-delivered mines represent a mine warfare capability that can close the northern and southern approaches to the Taiwan Strait to Chinese surface vessel traffic within 24 hours of a conflict commencing. China needs MCM vessels to counter that response. It is building them. The Hormuz timeline is telling it how many it needs and how fast they need to operate. Variable 3, the decision the United States is making at Hormuz that is really about China. Every operational lesson the U.S. Navy draws from Hormuz is being fed into Pacific war planning. This is not speculation. INDOPACOM and PASSIFLT maintain continuous operational analysis pipelines that absorb lessons from every major engagement the U.S. military conducts worldwide. But there is one specific decision being made at Hormuz, one capability being tested, one doctrine being refined, that has more direct relevance to a Taiwan conflict than any other element of the current operation. It is the expeditionary MCM concept. The Avenger-class MCM ships we covered are home-ported in Bahrain. Getting them to the Taiwan Strait in a crisis would take weeks. The plan knows this. The 30-day MCM response gap, the window between the start of a conflict and the arrival of U.S. MCM capability, is a variable in every Chinese war game involving mines in the Taiwan Strait. The Hormuz crisis is driving the United States Navy to develop a solution to that gap. Specifically, the capability to conduct mine countermeasure operations using forward-deployed assets, unmanned surface vehicles, helicopter-mounted laser detection systems, submarine-deployed mine neutralization systems that do not depend on the forward presence of Avenger-class hulls. The Textron CUSV unmanned surface vehicle, which we covered in the mine breakdown, can be deployed from a standard container ship or auxiliary vessel. It does not require a dedicated MCM hull. The ALMDS laser detection system mounts in a pod beneath any MH-60S Seahawk. The Archerfish disposal vehicle deploys from any ship with a crane and a fiber optic cable reel. The lesson the U.S. Navy is extracting from Hormuz is that MCM capability can be containerized, distributed, deployed from non-specialist hulls that are already forward positioned in the Western Pacific, Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force vessels, Australian frigates, South Korean destroyers, ships that are already in the region, already crewed, already fueled. A Taiwan conflict does not need to wait for Avenger-class hulls to transit from Bahrain. The MCM capability travels in containers on existing Allied hulls to wherever mines have been laid. China does not yet know the U.S. has reached this conclusion, but the procurement decisions and doctrine changes being driven by the Hormuz operation will make it visible within 12 to 18 months. And the window for China's Taiwan operation, the window that closes when the United States has distributed forward deployable MCM capability resident in Allied fleets, is shorter than Beijing's current planning assumptions reflect. The Hormuz crisis will end. The mines will be cleared. The Strait will reopen. Kitty Hawk will redeploy. Iran's missile inventory will be at a fraction of its pre-conflict level. The 150 tankers anchored outside the corridor will move. And China will have 47 days of operational data, possibly more by the time this video reaches you, that it did not have before the crisis began. That data will accelerate Chinese procurement. It will compress certain development timelines. It will drive doctrinal revisions in how the plan plans to fight a conflict in the Taiwan Strait. But it will also have driven American operational learning, the containerized MCM concept, the combined arms response that preserves VLS inventory, the CWIP electronic warfare data against real missile attacks, the intelligence harvest methodology that Kitty Hawk demonstrated. Both sides are learning. The question is who is learning faster and who has less time? China has 4.3 million barrels per day of oil dependency that passes through a strait it cannot control. It has a semiconductor industry that depends on a conflict not occurring to keep functioning. It has a domestic legitimacy structure that cannot survive the economic pressure of a multi-year maritime conflict with an adversary whose allies ring the Western Pacific. The United States has an ally of 23 million people on an island 100 miles off the Chinese coast, semiconductor manufacturing capacity that the global technology economy cannot replace, and a navy that just demonstrated at Hormuz that it can close a strait, clear a strait, and fight in a strait simultaneously against a committed adversary. China is watching all of this more carefully than anyone realizes, because what the United States Navy just showed Iran is what it would show China. And what it showed China is that the Malacca Dilemma is not a contingency. It is an operational reality, available for execution on any timeline, against any adversary. That calculation is running in Beijing right now, in a building 800 miles from the port where the empty tanker sits at anchor, waiting for a cargo that has not come. The tanker will eventually be filled. The ship will eventually sail. The calculation in Beijing will not stop running. In the port of Ningbo-Zhoushan, the very large crude carrier is still at anchor. The holds are still empty. The booking has not come. The tanker on the other end of its supply chain is still sitting 40 nautical miles outside the Strait of Hormuz, waiting for a corridor that a wooden ship is slowly clearing, mine by mine, at 6 knots, 200 meters at a time. The ship in Ningbo-Zhoushan costs $130 million. The cargo it would carry costs $160 million. Every day it sits idle costs its owner approximately $35,000 in charter fees and operating costs for a vessel producing nothing. Multiplied across China's entire Middle East oil supply chain, 4.3 million barrels per day, dozens of VLCCs in various stages of the $6,500 mile round trip between Hormuz and Chinese ports, The daily cost is $318 million, and counting. China did not fire a missile. China did not lay a mine. China did not sink a ship or challenge a carrier or activate a single military system. China is simply downstream of a conflict it did not start and cannot stop. In a world where 40% of its energy supply passes through geography it does not control, 36 years ago, a $1,500 mine tore through the hull of the USS Samuel B. Roberts, and Iran learned that the United States Navy could be bled. And what China is learning at Hormuz is something different, something larger, something that does not fit in a tactical debrief or an intelligence assessment or a naval procurement document. China is learning what it means to exist in a world where the Strait of Hormuz is a door, and the United States Navy holds the key. That lesson is not about Iran. It is not about oil. It is not about the 47 days and the $14.9 billion and the empty holds in Ningbo-Zhoushan. It is about Taiwan and what happens to 4.3 million barrels per day the moment that conflict begins. China is watching Hormuz more carefully than anyone realizes, because China is not watching Iran lose. China is watching itself in a mirror 7 years from now.